Ladies and gentlemen, today is June 22nd, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Hello.
Yo,
Hey, how are you?
doing pretty well, with a major exception.
Major exception. Oh.
Yeah, I had a 3-year expired graham cracker, and it was so foul I had to spit it out. But aside from that, I'm doing okay. I thought it was just going to be stale, but it was the very wrong flavor.
Yikes. Well, I guess you learned the hard way.
Yeah.
Eat that stuff.
Yeah. I was like, it's a dry graham cracker in a sealed container. How bad could it be? And the answer is really fucking bad.
Live and learn.
Yep. How was the texture? It was kind of mushy. It wasn't really crisp anymore. It should be a crisp graham cracker, but it was not. Alas, we survived it. Aside from that, it's been a pretty good and interesting week for me. Helped out family and stuff with more construction. Got to help tow my dad's old 1969 Mercury Cougar back and then push it. And pushing a muscle car is super heavy because they're just made of solid metal. It's before they made cars out of plastic. So that was a good feat of strength. And it's been really nice out here. And I heard it was a really quiet week, not much going on. So I don't know if we're going to end early.
Well, I know you're being sarcastic, but you're actually more correct than you might think. Because there really hasn't been a whole lot going on the past week, save for the big item.
Yeah, everyone's been asking today, is there going to be a world discussion? I hadn't seen very much aside from the headlines. For those of you who have lived under a rock, the U.S. bombed Iran at 3 different nuclear sites, I think.
Correct.
I haven't really read about it, but I did see the headlines that U.S. leaders warn Iran to not attack back, which is just comical to me. When you bomb someone and then you tell them, you better not hit me back.
Yeah, well, I mean, what else can they do? I'm not entirely opposed in principle, because you either have a nuclear non-proliferation regime or you don't, right? If you're not willing to enforce it, then it's more of a nuclear inconvenience regime, which isn't going to work. But if you are going to enforce that, then you do need to plan for it. You need to game out all of the possibilities. You need to know what to hit. You need to know what you're willing to concede on, what you're not. And I've never really known the Trump administration in either of its 2 terms to be particularly good at planning. So that's my main concern at this point. But beyond that, if they can stick the landing, then I don't think this is necessarily a bad development.
So this is kind of pointing back to some non-proliferation act for nukes. What's the lore on that?
It's a treaty, an international treaty. Basically, I want to say in like the middle of the Cold War, 60s or so, all of the nuclear powers got together and decided that it would be best if nobody else really got nuclear weapons. And they decided to sign a treaty to that effect, in which they all agreed not to give nuclear weapons to anybody. And they also leaned on countries that did not have nuclear weapons to also sign on to the treaty so that they would be legally bound not to seek nuclear weapons. So that's sort of the Cliff Notes version of it. I'm a little sketchy on the specific details of when it was signed and whatnot, but that was the idea. And countries that were in violation of the treaty, that had signed the treaty anyway, would be subject to sanctions, if not direct action. And obviously sanctions have not worked with Iran, so they've backed themselves into a corner wherein they are technically obligated by a treaty not to do what they're doing, and technically have to accept the sanctions as the legal remedy for that. And having still tried to develop a nuclear weapon, all the countries that don't want them to have them basically have no other choice but direct action. And we're kind of seeing that play out now. The US had been pretty gun shy about doing it because it didn't really know what the ramifications would be. Because it's easy in principle to say the United States is the most powerful country in the world, can destroy some facilities and thereby destroy their ability to build a nuclear bomb. But the details are a little more complicated than that. Because yes, we can bomb the sites that we know about, but we can't really do damage assessment particularly well because they're all underground, especially Fordo, which is particularly known to be fortified. And also, even if you do successfully hit those targets, it's possible for them to still have enough fissile material left over and to make a nuclear bomb. And it's possible for them to have enough equipment left over to process that into weapons-grade uranium. I forget the technical details of it, but they could have enough machinery left to refine the materials they need into what they would need to build a nuclear warhead. So if that's the case, then they'll still be able to get a bomb. And then they'll be able to start threatening Israel or the West or all of the above with potential nuclear retaliation of some kind if the bombing doesn't stop, or perhaps if other demands are not also made. Although that's not really a great option either, since Iran is really not in a position to win a nuclear war with the United States. Even if they have 1, 2, or half a dozen nuclear weapons, it's not clear if they have a great mechanism by which to deliver them. They've been trying to develop ballistic missile technology that would allow them to build delivery vehicles for nuclear warheads. But I don't know that they've ever actually tested them, certainly not with nuclear warheads. So if they did start using nuclear weapons against, say, the US 6th Fleet in the Persian Gulf or other American bases, or against Israel, presumably there would be either some degree of nuclear retaliation from the United States or massive nuclear retaliation from the United States, which technically is doctrine for when the United States is under attack itself. And that's not going to be a great trade-off for Iran. So the cost-benefit there doesn't really check out, which means that even if they get a nuclear weapon, that's not going to be enough to stop the attacks, I would guess. Even if that would be a political complication for the Trump administration. But as we all know, the Trump administration is very good about circumventing political complications. His voters give him enough of the benefit of the doubt that he can generally breeze through those pretty easily. So Washington seems to have the high cards here. I'm not sure that there's anything Iran can realistically do to retaliate in a way that would actually make the attack stop. Mm. And if they do anything too controversial, like terrorist attacks in the United States, attacking US bases in the region, the United States in those cases has what's called escalatory dominance, which means if that there is a tit for tat back and forth, eventually the scale and power of American retaliation will reach a point that the Iranians cannot match. And debatably, we're already kind of at that point, because again, there's just not much Iran can realistically do to match what either the United States or Israel is doing to it right now. So there might be my suspicion at this point is that there's going to be some symbolic response, retaliation from the Iranian government. And it could be drawn out. They could try for a war of attrition with Israel, where they basically wait for the Israelis to get tired of beating on them, which sounds goofy, but that's kind of where they're at right now. If Israel runs low on munitions, or if the United States government just kind of gets tired for waiting for the conflict to resolve itself, it's possible that at that point there could be more willingness in Washington to reach some kind of negotiated settlement that is relatively more favorable to the Iranian government. But that's risky. It doesn't necessarily cost the US all that much just to wait out the Iranians. And in the meantime, the Israelis can just keep wailing on them. I think they've been killing intelligence officials for the last couple days in particular, among other targets.
What's the benefit or motivation from Iran breaking the treaty and making nuclear stuff? Just so they can project power more in their region?
So that depends on who you ask. Nuclear weapons are not really good for projecting power in a region. You really need conventional forces to do that, or at least money. So the Iranians, with their oil money and with their proxies in the region, have been pretty good about that over the past 10 years, relatively speaking. So nuclear weapons are not about projecting power. It's more about deterrence. You don't want to get Iraqed, like Saddam Hussein was by the U.S. government. If Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons, or for that matter, if Ukraine had nuclear weapons, neither would have been invaded. It would have been seen as too risky to invade a state that had such weapons. And given that the Iranian nation, not just the current Iranian government, but the Iranian nation, has been the subject of repeated attempts at regime change over the past half century plus, you can't entirely blame them for wanting to deter what they see as inevitable Western aggression. So it's more to do with that. And the Bush administration in particular was an impetus to restart the nuclear program. They'd had one, I believe, in the 80s and early 90s, but then they started to shut it down. They had more of a reformist government for much of the 1990s, which was not as interested in a nuclear weapon. But then 9/11 happened, and the Bush administration, this is the George W. Bush administration, famously wrapped Iran into his axis of evil, as he called it at the time, which was Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And that made the Iranian government seriously reconsider the nuclear weapon program. And from what I remember, they started it back up again not long after that. And of course, the American invasion of Iraq kind of sealed that. That's after the United States unilaterally and debatably illegally invaded a sovereign country, that being Iraq. And after all the history of Western intervention in Iran, the Iranian government was quite concerned about the prospect of an invasion of itself. And so a nuclear weapon was seen as about the only thing that would deter such an invasion. And so they started doubling down on the nuclear program. Yeah, that eventually resulted during the Obama administration in the famous nuclear deal, which was a painstakingly negotiated agreement amongst not only Iran and the United States, but also a number of other world powers, Russia, Germany, the UK, China, etc., to all agree that sanctions would be eased on Iran, the sanctions having been placed on them in retaliation for trying to develop a nuclear weapon. Those sanctions would be eased as part of the deal in exchange for Iran agreeing to not scrap its nuclear program. This was very controversial at the time. They would not have to scrap it, but they would have to agree to a number of monitoring mechanisms. And they would have to agree to limit their enrichment of nuclear materials. So that's the gist of it. And a lot of hawks really didn't like that because they didn't think that the Iranians would actually honor the agreement. They believed that they were going to continue developing nuclear weapons in secret. And they noted over the course of the subsequent implementation of the agreement that some of the monitoring mechanisms were not being respected, which they saw as explicit Iranian cheating. And hawks also noted that the agreement did not include anything about Iranian support for proxies in the Middle East, nor about development of ballistic missiles, which hypothetically could be used to deliver nuclear warheads. So the argument in favor of the Obama nuclear deal was basically that there wasn't anything else they could do short of military action. And like I mentioned before, that comes with risks. And so they preferred the diplomatic route, even if the result was imperfect. Hawks also noted that the agreement had a sunset provision. It was only going to last about 10 years or so. Actually, it's about to expire, I think, either this year or next year, which may have been part of the impetus for the current hostilities, but that's debatable. But anyway, the Dove counter-argument to that is that a lot can change in 10 years, and maybe the Iranian government itself will become less hawkish over time, and a new government will come that is less interested in developing nuclear weapons, Or maybe in 10 years' time, the Iranian government itself will have been overthrown, and there will be a completely different one that is more amenable to international concerns about nuclear weapons. And I want to emphasize here, too, that the nuclear deal was internationally backed. This was not something the United States was imposing on Iran. Many powerful actors in international affairs, including China, Russia, and Europe, don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon because they don't particularly trust them with nuclear weapons. And in general, they don't want nuclear proliferation. Non-proliferation is in everybody's interests. So even though China and Russia in particular have decent relations with Iran, they have in the past actually pressured them to abandon the program. And there's some debate now about what they'll do now that Iran seems to be set on getting one. Presumably, they are going to try, if at all possible, to rush to get one. So that begs the question of what Beijing and Moscow will do about that, if anything. I was reading today that in the UN, the Chinese and Russian representatives were pushing for an immediate ceasefire. But it's not clear to me that that would be enough for the Iranian government to fully abandon its nuclear program. So whether or not they ultimately, counterintuitively, side with the United States in heaping pressure on Iran to end its program in exchange for some kind of concessions, probably from Israel and the United States, or if they cite the Israeli and American aggression as mooting the point of non-proliferation, at least in this case, and actually back Iran. That's going to be an open question going forward. I suspect they're going to try to take a middle path that is non-committal, that they're not really going to back Iran with anything more than rhetoric, but that they're not really going to double down, so to speak.
Or throw the weight behind anybody.
Yeah. I mean, they don't want to be seen to abandoning them, but they don't want to support their nuclear program either. So they'll probably pressure them in secret to try to abandon it. That would be my guess. But I don't know if there's going to be any teeth behind those threats. So it's still early days. It's not entirely clear how all of this plays out. But that is as you asked, that's the impetus behind their desire for a nuclear weapon. It is principally defensive. And as I mentioned, the United States has given them reasons to be concerned and to think that they might need some kind of deterrent.
There was some headlines and stuff about how it was a strike from the U.S. that was done without congressional approval, but I don't know what that means.
Technically, that's true, but it doesn't really matter. The United States government, I should say the executive branch, is technically, encouraged, I should say, not obligated. The executive branch is encouraged to consult Congress regarding foreign entanglements like this, but they don't have to. And I believe it's called the War Powers Act, gives the executive something like a 60, 90-day window where they can engage in foreign hostilities without clearance from Congress. Anything more than that, and a vote has to be brought in Congress in order to sanction it. And if Congress does not sanction it beyond that sunset provision, beyond that deadline, then the executive branch would be legally obligated to cease hostilities. But we're well within that window right now. It's only been going on for like a week.
Gotcha.
And it'll probably be over before the War Powers Act's deadline operationalizes. You can consider that another manifestation of the imperial presidency, as it's been called. The executive branch has been getting stronger relative to the other branches over the past half century plus. And the result is that they have granted the executive, that is to say the legislature specifically, has granted the executive what would be considered extraordinary discretion compared to standards of the early 20th century, for example. Now, some of that is necessary. We live in a world where you need to be able to respond quickly to events. And so there's not always time to just consult Congress on everything and have a vote and do all of that jazz. But the concern is that at this point, it's habitual. more than necessary. That is to say that consecutive executives now have just done what they wanted to do without consulting Congress just because they can. So in that sense, while they are in keeping with the law, they are breaching the spirit of it. The War Powers Act and the discretion granted to the executive was not granted to let the executive just do whatever the fuck it wants. It was done so that the executive could respond to emergencies in a timely fashion if needed. And that power was granted on the assumption that more morally and legally ambiguous foreign entanglements would involve more consultation with Congress. A kind of honor system approach, if you will. Obviously, that has not worked well over time. But that was the inherent trade-off. And so for a while, the trade-off was workable, especially during the Cold War. But now in the post-Cold War environment, we're really seeing the downside come out more and more of that trade-off. So reform is probably needed there, but whenever any given party controls both the executive and the legislature, there's very little impetus to try to curb the power of the executive, because of course the party in power wants to use executive power for its own ends as much as possible. So sooner or later, there's going to have to be a bipartisan consensus that the War Powers Act in particular needs to be reformed, if not the imperial presidency generally. But that's kind of a tangent, getting off topic, but that should happen. I would definitely say that should be a point of agreement for everybody. But that said, yeah, that's why it doesn't matter that Congress hasn't approved of this. The executive did not need congressional approval technically here.
I see. It would only be if we continued doing this for a redacted period of time.
Correct.
Gotcha. I see. Are there any other countries that would do similar things, or is the U.S. kind of taking the initiative of we're going to be the ones to punish them for breaking the treaty?
Similar? What do you mean by similar things?
Are there other countries who would do airstrikes at nuclear sites in a similar fashion? Or are they just going to...
Would is debatable. I think the better question is could. And the answer is no. Nobody else has the capability to do what the United States is doing in Iran right now.
Oh, why not? They don't have bases near there?
Nope. Nobody else has the ability to project force into Iranian airspace. Neither do they have the munitions that would be necessary to penetrate all of the Earth that is over the top of the relevant enrichment facilities. The United States, when it bombed these facilities, had to use what are called bunker busters. These are deep penetration munitions that are designed to penetrate hundreds of feet of earth, if not earthworks, concrete and whatnot, in order to get at command and control centers that are buried underneath. In this case, they're not going after command and control. It's about the nuclear facilities, but same deal, like both are fortified, and conventional munitions cannot penetrate that degree of protection. So you need a specialized munition specifically designed to penetrate all of that. So that's what the United States has been using, and as far as I know, nobody else has those.
Yeah.
And like you say, nobody else has bases in the region, really, that they could even launch an attack from. So just in terms of having a presence in the region, having the capability to send aircraft into Iranian airspace unmolested, and having the correct munitions to actually destroy the targets, no other country has a combination of all three, or even any one of them, for that matter. I guess countries in the region have bases in the region, so I shouldn't say that, but obviously they don't have the capacity to launch airstrike that could destroy those facilities. The closest you could come is Israel, but of course the Israelis don't have the bunker busters that would be necessary. That was why Netanyahu was pressuring the Trump administration to jump into the conflict and to hit the targets that were the most fortified, since the U.S. was the only one capable of that. So only the United States was capable of actually enforcing the non-proliferation treaty in this case, at least to this degree. Now, I guess it's important to point out that while Iran is violating that treaty, the United States, under the first Trump administration, that is to say, the Trump administration in its first term, technically did violate the nuclear agreement that was agreed by the previous Obama administration. And, regardless of whether or not the Iranians can be said to be violating or honoring that treaty, the United States definitely flipped over the table and set it back to zero. And it wasn't entirely clear what the Trump administration had in mind there, but ultimately they did not go forward with strikes, even though the Iranians kind of teased that they would increase enrichment. But they never actually went full throttle for a nuclear weapon after that. They just slowly, incrementally increased enrichment over time to try to pressure the West and the United States into returning to a nuclear deal or negotiating a new one. The Biden administration tried to negotiate a new one, but it never went anywhere. Partly that was because the government in Iran during the Biden administration was a hawkish one and wasn't all that interested in negotiating. I think last year, the Iranian government had a change in government after the previous president died in a helicopter crash, bizarrely, and the new government was actually relatively dovish. But then the American government changed from a relatively dovish Biden administration to a hawkish Trump administration. So back to the first term, basically, and the circumstances thereof. And the result was that negotiations renewed and seemed to be kind of slowly converging back on something that was actually very similar to the Obama nuclear deal. But something happened. The Israelis obviously have long been interested in hitting Iran. They had said that the Iranians were increasing enrichment to a degree that would put them maybe 2 weeks away from building their first nuclear bomb. And so they were quite insistent that now was the time to strike. And I guess Washington agreed with them, or at least the Trump administration did, because they gave the green light, so to speak. And the Israelis attacked first, but it wasn't clear if the U.S. would jump in after. But the Israelis made the point that it was kind of dumb just to attack Iran's nuclear capacity without going after the most well-defended facilities, because otherwise you're basically just signaling to Iran that they need to go for a weapon. They're under attack, we're violating their sovereignty, just like they were afraid we would do. If we leave them the nuclear facilities at Fordo intact, then they're definitely going to use them to develop a bomb. So we should get the U.S. involved, hit those targets, and just decimate the nuclear program as much as possible. That's pretty fair reasoning. That might be what the Trump administration had in mind from the start, even though they've been talking about deals and negotiations and whatnot. I think last week, the Trump administration, not even that, just a couple of days ago, really, the Trump administration was saying that they would wait 2 weeks to give the Iranians time to decide whether or not they wanted to negotiate. And then they would consider military intervention, that is to say, hitting the enrichment facilities. And instead of 2 weeks, that turned into a couple days, because obviously they started hitting the targets yesterday. So that, again, it's not clear if that was the plan from the start, or maybe they got some intelligence that the Iranians were trying to make a play for a bomb, or if maybe the Trump administration just kind of had a change of heart midstream, which wouldn't surprise me.
Chad's asking if you said if we know they were breaking the treaty, didn't you just say that they asserted that they were developing them?
Asserted that they were developing them?
Was Iran saying that they were developing nukes?
There's never been a point when Iran said they were developing nukes. We, hypothetically, the international community, knew they were developing nukes because of basically American intelligence. Russia and China obviously not going to just take America's word for it, but they apparently were convinced by the nature of the intelligence. So yeah, that's basically America trying to convince everybody that Iran is trying to get a nuclear weapon, and successfully doing so. Hence the nuclear negotiations under Obama, as well as pressure from more hawkish administrations.
I see.
Yeah, this is not an Iraq situation. This is not the U.S. government just making up the fact that a country is trying to seek weapons of mass destruction. Iran has good reason to seek them. And you could say that they've never seriously wanted to get them, and that they've only teased it in order to generate leverage in negotiations. But unlike with Iraq, most of the world genuinely believes that the Iranians are pushing for a nuclear weapon. So I infer then that there is genuine grounds to believe that they are.
I see.
I'm sure people will point out that the US tried to sell Iraq in the same way, but I would point out that the United States was never actually successful at convincing the international community that Iraq was actually developing weapons of mass destruction. Iraq was very much something done on the initiative of the Bush administration. And in so much as they got countries to partner with them, it was largely the result of varying degrees of bullying. They leaned pretty hard on NATO allies in particular to participate. Most of the smaller countries in NATO ended up doing so. The larger ones managed to blow them off because the US didn't have enough leverage to get them involved. So that's why Germany and France in particular did not join. Mm. But it's not the case with Iran. France and Germany are definitely in on the pressure Iran to not get nuclear weapons wagon. Mm-hmm.
Do you think the U.S. will attack again, or are they satisfied with the damage they've dealt with the strikes?
It's too early to say, because the facilities are deep underground and we can't really tell how much damage was really done. And so that's going to make damage assessment difficult, and in turn, it'll be difficult to ascertain whether or not further strikes will be needed. It could be that the Trump administration actually does want a negotiated settlement, and that all of the violence happening right now is basically them signaling that it's just going to get worse for them until they make concessions and reach an agreement. If that's the case, then the US and Israel will probably just continue bombing until they get some kind of agreement, given that, again, there's not really much leverage Iran has to dissuade them from doing so. But if the Trump administration had really wanted to go hard, I feel like they could have done so from the start. They would not have had to have wait for Israel to do 1 week's worth of strikes before jumping in with some limited strikes on the most high value targets. They could have just gone for all of the targets themselves. Mm. So there seems to be an escalating degree of pressure here that Washington is bringing to bear. And I suspect what they want is for Iran to just come to the table. That could be an expression of risk aversion on the part of Washington. They may be concerned that there are possibilities they haven't thought of, the famous Rumsfeldian unknown unknowns. And so in respect for those, they may be taking a more incremental approach rather than going all in from the start. I'm sure that they would very much prefer to avoid a ground invasion. I don't think that's in the cards at all. But the fact that that's not in the cards is actually in Iran's favor. So if they do drag this out to the point where the only thing that the United States could do to stop them from retaliating, if they do eventually start retaliating, is to remove the government, which can only realistically be done with a ground invasion, then they're going to be in a pickle, because they're going to have to choose between suffering further Iranian retaliation without really significant there will be significant pushback, but basically indefinitely, since presumably the Iranians can do low-level retaliation indefinitely, or they can launch what will be a very, very expensive, unpopular invasion of Iran, which may not even work in the end, because Iran is basically too geographically large to occupy. Realistically speaking, that basically just can't happen. Maybe you could find local allies in Iran that would be willing to work with you and help you do that, but that seems very unlikely. You've got to think there would be a big rally around the flag effect in the event of an invasion, even more so than there's probably already happening now. So I imagine the Trump administration is trying to kind of pressure them into an agreement without going all the way. And the Iranians right now are probably trying to decide whether or not they're willing to suffer a prolonged period of bombardment in exchange for trying to exhaust the Americans and Israelis. I suspect that's going to be how they're going to approach it. But again, this is kind of speculation. I don't really know. I'm just a guy. We'll have to wait and see. That's the real answer.
Understood. I think we do have some questions about it rolling in. Fuzzy Cord is handling those.
Let's see. Okay. A few U.S. politicians have stated that our government is simply being bought out by Israel, hence our commitment to this alliance, even though it seems anti-American to attack Iran. How true is this? I don't think it's anti-American to attack Iran. Again, for me, it comes down to the non-proliferation treaty. Like, are we willing to enforce that or not? This kind of goes back to the debate in American politics about the liberal international order and whether or not that is worth propagating. Because at the moment, it's kind of unpopular. People don't really like it very much. They see it as expensive. They don't think the United States gets credit for upholding it, nor do a lot of people think that the United States really benefits from it. So there's a sense then that the United States acting as the world's policeman is not really worth the effort. So if you think like that, then yes, the current intervention in Iran probably seems very foreboding. It probably feels a lot like Iraq or some of the various other unpopular interventions that have happened over the past couple decades. On the other hand, though, if you are a traditional proponent of American power in the world, or at least the American role as protector of the liberal international order, the Trump administration, which was a populist administration elected not to do things like this, the fact that they have done something like this probably seems very refreshing. This was not what would be expected, given the campaign that Trump ran in 2024. But at the same time, it's not all that surprising. I think a lot of people, including conservatives, have noted by now that Trump talks big about being a liberal authoritarian and challenging norms and rules, the constitutional order, but at the end of the day, he generally colors in the lines. He talks bigger than he bites, and in fact, he rarely actually bites at all. So in that sense, Trump is just a demagogue, but not somebody who's actually going to overthrow the government or the constitutional order. So Iran and bombing Iran is kind of in that vein. He talked big about not getting America involved in new conflicts and whatnot, but at the same time, he's largely respecting America's role in the world order, at least as far as that's defined as defending liberal internationalism. You can kind of see that in Ukraine, too. There was a lot of talk earlier in the year about the United States possibly abandoning Ukraine, cutting Ukraine off from aid. But after that storm kind of passed, it's pretty much back to status quo ante. There might be some new drama about a new aid bill being passed or not being passed, but I don't think we've gotten there yet. So we'll see. But at least for the moment, Trump isn't really handling Ukraine that much different than his predecessor. So how people think about that just comes down to politics. Like, is it good that he's not being a populist as far as foreign policy, or is it a bad thing? Again, it's just going to depend. But I don't think it's anti-American, per se. He's basically just doing what American governments have been doing for some time now. And it's all technically legal. I don't know that the Non-Proliferation Treaty has any provisions about enforcing non-proliferation through violence, but that would at least be in the spirit of the agreement. And certainly the United States government has always implicitly threatened to do as much. And I don't think Israel has bought out America either. That's kind of dated thinking at this point. Israeli influence on American politics has actually waned over the past 15-some years. Over the course of the Bush administration, there were a lot of people in American politics that blamed Israel. for the boondoggle of Iraq, which was not really that fair. Israel could not make us do that. That was something we very much did to ourselves. But a lot of people did blame them, and a lot of people in turn started putting pressure on American politicians to pay less heed to AIPAC and other organizations that were vectors of Israeli influence in American politics. And I think over the past, again, 10, 15 years, the Israeli government has struggled more and more to kind of get its way. The Trump administration has played ball, but that's been done more for its own reasons. That is to say, in so much as the Trump administration has done things that Israel likes, they did not do them because Israel liked them. They did them because they wanted to look tough. They wanted to do it for domestic political consumption. They wanted to do it because they wanted to give more discretion to countries in the Middle East so the United States could be less involved. That last one is something the Obama administration actually did during his term. So, getting the United States out of the Middle East, but also trying to ensure credibility was maintained. That's been something both the Obama administration and the Trump administration have tried to do. So you can kind of see this as being an extension of that. He talks about wanting to get out of the region, but still bombs Iran. That's pretty consistent with what had been the trend in American foreign policy over the past 20 years, basically since the United States pulled out of Iraq. So, long story short, I don't think it's very true, to answer the question. And I would point out that it's not really an alliance the United States has with Israel. There is no treaty alliance between the two states. Cooperation between the two is purely informal. Ties are significant, especially in the industrial base, the defense industrial base, so to speak. But that's not done by treaty either. That's all just the United States recognizing Israel as a close partner that it's willing to do business with and cooperate with and share intelligence with as well. But beyond that, the United States is not technically obligated to do anything vis-a-vis Israel. It does so historically purely for strategic reasons.
Israel's a very contentious topic for Twitch chat. Say, what is Israel's actual goal? Someone else says, to become a superpower.
Well, Israel can't be a superpower. They don't have enough people. It's just a fundamentally small country. They could be a regional power. They're kind of already there, but Israel is just too strategically precarious to ever realistically be a permanent regional power. Again,
a small nation with mostly enemies on all sides.
Yeah, that's the issue. And even within its own territory, in so much as you consider the Palestinian territory is Israeli territory, they have a significant chunk of people that don't like them. So, Israel is kind of constantly in danger, and that's not really a good position to be in strategically. They've got Egypt to the south and Turkey to the north, and both of those pose a significant military threat to Israel. The Egyptians have been beaten before, but that doesn't mean that invariably they're always going to be beaten. They came pretty close to losing in 73, the Yom Kippur War, when they were attacked by Egypt and Syria at the same time. And Turkey is a whole other animal entirely. The Turkish army is much more professional and modern than the Egyptian army has ever been. So that's actually a much more substantive threat to Israel. Israel does have better relations with the Gulf monarchies at this point. But how long are those going to last? Those are not particularly popular in the region. I think Mohammed bin Salman has kind of restored some degree of legitimacy to the Saudi government, but sooner or later, people are going to demand more representative politics. And if and when they get them, it's likely that the Gulf monarchies will become less tolerant of Israel. And that's assuming that the transition is peaceful. It's always possible that there could be a revolution in this, that, or the other Middle Eastern country that shifts them from being pro-Western to anti-Western. We've already seen that happen with Iran. Iran under the Shah was steadfast ally of the West, big ally of Israel, very friendly relations, and then the revolution came. So, even if the Abraham Accords expand, those are only as good as the governments that signed them. And the governments in the region, for the most part, are fundamentally illegitimate. A truly democratic Middle East is not one that would be on great terms with Israel. And so, in so much as that's the case, Israel is kind of living on borrowed time. Its ability to maintain good relations in the region kind of depends on the maintenance of what are fundamentally violent, undemocratic regimes. And invariably, that type of regime itself is on borrowed time. They don't last. So Israel can do well for a while, especially so long as it has American backing, but its position is eroding. It really needs to try to solidify some kind of resolution to its difficulties in the region that goes beyond just recognizing it, right? The Abraham Accords, keep in mind, are just about recognizing Israel. They're not fundamentally about some kind of broader permanent peace. So there does need to be a resolution of the Palestinian issue and a broader normalization of Israel's existence in the region. If neither of those things happens, then eventually the region will turn on them even more than it already has. And American backing will eventually also erode. There's already significant changes with regard to the profile of people in the United States regarding how much and to what degree they support Israel. It used to be a bipartisan consensus issue. Now it's a partisan issue. And sooner or later, it might become a bipartisan issue again in a way that is not favorable to Israel and American backing thereof. So I don't think Israel becoming a superpower or a regional power is realistic. They're definitely punching above their weight at the moment, but the fundamental structural disadvantages they have definitely make it hard for them to kind of go further. There's a cap to how much they can realistically achieve in the region.
Is it the conservatives that support Israel and the progressives who don't right now?
Roughly speaking, yes. But if you dig into the details, it's actually a little more complicated. Certainly, the progressive left increasingly turns on them because they see Israel's occupation of the West Bank, if not also Gaza, depending on how you want to define occupation, as representing a kind of colonial occupation. And the Palestinian resistance, therefore, is interpreted as a liberation struggle of the anti-colonial variety that was very common in the mid-20th century. Mm-hmm. So for that reason, they oppose Israel and criticize them. But there's also an element on the right that doesn't like Israel. Part of it is just anti-Semitism. There's a lot of people that, for whatever reason, just hate Jews. And so Israel, of course, is the country of Jews. So naturally, they don't like America backing them or taking risks on their behalf. But there is another element to conservative opposition to Israel that is more libertarian in outlook. There are conservatives who just don't like the idea of the United States being involved overseas. And they see American backing for Israel as putting the United States in a position where it has to take a side in regional affairs that puts the U.S. and U.S. interests at risk when they don't need to be put at risk. They think that it would be better just to withdraw from the region partially or fully and to disentangle the United States from Israeli interests and concerns. So that's a more libertarian perspective. It has deep roots in the United States. I don't think it has a whole lot of traction at the moment. But that said, you could have said the same thing, 20 years ago with the invasion of Iraq. There were a lot of libertarians very angry about that. But most conservatives backed the war until it started going badly, and then there was a big shift back towards the libertarian perspective. And that shift is actually part of the reason we ended up with sort of the current populist conservatism that we have now. So another shift like that could happen with regard to Israel. Thus far, they've been pretty insulated from that. But further erosion of conservative support would probably augur an implosion of the political position that support for Israel has in the current American zeitgeist, in current American foreign policy. And I think in general, the trend line regarding support for Israel is downward. So if that continues, then eventually you'll reach a critical mass where there's not enough support in either party to realistically continue it.
I see. Did get another question on it.
Oh.
I'll tell you what, people are fired up about that region.
They always are. Yeah, everybody's got their side. I don't see a new question.
Oh, gee. You said it was a pretty quiet week.
Yeah.
Aside from the strike.
Let's see. Just 2 items that I had here. One about Thailand and one brief one about the Trump administration. There was an article in The Guardian about a Trump executive order that had to do with the Veterans Administration. Apparently, they're reinterpreting a law such that people who work for the VA would be allowed to discriminate against people trying to get care in certain circumstances. Basically, there are still some protected classes, but there had been an executive order years ago that expanded the protected classes in the case of the VA to include people of certain political affiliations, party affiliations. You couldn't discriminate against people because they were married or unmarried, etc. So those are not protected classes, but they were to be treated as protected classes because of the old executive order. Now, under the new executive order, the protected classes are being restricted to the ones dictated by law. And so now, going forward, hypothetically, if this does survive litigation, which I'm sure has already started, then you would be able to deny care to someone because they were a member of the Democratic or Republican Party, because they're not married, etc. So, of course, that had people pretty excited because that seemed, why would you do that? What is the point of that? It seems like the administration is opening the door here for a little social engineering, and they may want to try to pressure people into getting married or to punish people for their political affiliation or etc. So given all of the accusations about the Trump administration eroding rule of law in the United States, this seems to be another step in that direction. So whether or not it goes forward, whether or not it survives litigation, that'll be what to watch for. But for now, this is just another item on the threat board.
Gotcha.
The threat board is quite crowded these days. Lots of things to keep your eye on. So there was that, and then there was Thailand. Thailand continues its tradition of having cute, attractive prime ministers. Their current prime minister is the niece of Thaksin Shinawatra. And I apologize if I mispronounce the names. Do you remember Thaksin Shinawatra?
Yeah, the name sounds familiar.
Yeah, so he's a billionaire telecom businessman in Thailand. And he became a populist politician decades ago. Basically ran on, spending more government money on the people, providing a stronger safety net, etc. And he won power for a while, but then he got on bad terms with the army, as well as just conservatives in Thailand generally. And there was a coup. So then he was kicked out. And for a while, the military ran the government, but people were upset about that. There were protests, so the army allowed new elections. And when the new elections came, Shinawatra's party won again. Now, Thaksin Shinawatra himself had basically had to go into exile and could not return to Thailand. So he couldn't himself become prime minister of Thailand again, or even just campaign in Thailand. So when his party won power again, power, that is to say the prime minister's office, was granted to his daughter, whom I believe was named Yingluck Shinawatra. So she was in power a while, but then there was a big scandal about corruption, basically a repeat of what happened before. There was another coup, lots of protests. This time, the army stayed in power for an extended period of time. I think it was like 5 to 7 years. But eventually, they did hold new elections. Now, in the new elections, which were held just a year or two ago, there was an alliance created between a reformist party led by a wealthy tech billionaire, I believe, or maybe a tech millionaire. I don't quite remember. But that was very popular with the younger voters. And that actually eroded the position of Shinawatra's party, which had traditionally been the main party of reformists and the political left in Thailand. So he didn't entirely like that, but they had a common enemy in the form of the conservatives and the army. So they ran together. They did very well, and then there was a betrayal. Thaksin betrayed his reformist allies and agreed to create a coalition government with conservative pro-army military parties. This surprised everybody, because Thaksin and the conservatives have hated each other for a long time now. So the fact that both of them saw a common threat in the reformists, so much so that they were willing to enter a coalition, was quite shocking. And it was very disappointing for the reformists, who believed that maybe finally they could have a liberal government that was willing to make changes to Thai society and fix some things. Well, was not to be. So as part of the new coalition government, Thaksin's niece this time was made prime minister. And she's gotten into trouble recently. I don't think we've talked about it, but for the past month or so, there's been border clashes between Thai military forces and Cambodian military forces. They're pretty minor. It just has to do with the disputed border. You know, there's not a lot going on the border between Thailand and Cambodia. And so historically, they haven't especially cared about exactly where the border is, but there was an incident, basically, a few weeks ago in which a Thai soldier fired at some Cambodian border guards, something to that effect. And so that led to exchanges of fire. And so it's there's been a tit for tat happening. So the Thai Prime Minister Shinawatra, made a phone call to the Prime Minister of Cambodia. This is a guy named Hun Sen. And the contents of the phone call were recorded, and Hun Sen apparently distributed the recordings to about 80 politicians. And it was one of them who eventually leaked it to the press. And so the conversation apparently involved a degree of deference from the Thai Prime Minister towards Hun Sen that conservatives in Thailand have not liked. They've jumped on that. And the backlash has been strong enough that one of the political parties that comprise the ruling coalition has left the coalition. Now, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, the coalition still has a majority, but it's very narrow. And there are other conservative parties in the coalition that are threatening to leave if the prime minister does not resign. Now, if you want to know exactly what caused all this, the specific contents of the phone call involved the Thai prime minister saying that the military commander, whom has been in control of the border region in question, where the clashes have been happening, quote, just wanted to look cool, end quote. And she also said that she would take care of Hun Sen's concerns. So that was apparently insufficiently hawkish for Thai conservatives, and they've been going after her now. So there's some question as to whether or not this conservative Shinawatra alliance is going to last. So that's been the drama recently in Thailand.
I just had Thai food yesterday.
I know what you have.
Oh my gosh. It was some of the most Americanized Thai food I've ever experienced. It was a curry that had chicken in it and there was rice, but it didn't have anything that was really distinctly Thai about it. So I ended up asking for some hot peppers or something to make it spicier. And the waitress said, okay, I'll go get you some jalapenos. And I was like, okay. But then they actually did bring those little red peppers that are in Thai food. So I think the owner's wife is actually Thai, but the clientele in South Dakota is definitely not Thai. So you can't exactly make a Thai restaurant for Thai people in South Dakota. So
yeah, I suspect as much.
It's made more American friendly.
Well, you have my condolences.
Yeah, it's okay. We had a decent time. There were some really good Thai food places in Dallas Fort Worth where we were. There's great food in DFW of all kinds, which is nice.
Yeah, that's probably one of the things that keeps me here. That and poverty. Can't afford to move. But if I could afford to move, I might stay anyway just because there are lots of amenities here. Also, the urban layout of the Metroplex is very antisocial, which suits me just fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you don't have to deal with people. You can just drive everywhere. Mitigates human contact. Much to my liking. Suits my personality very well.
Yep. Fellow internet nerds. Outside? What's that? I heard it has good graphics and no respawn. I'll pass.
Well, that's pretty much all I had as far as world affairs. Iran was the big thing and is the ongoing big thing. We'll probably be talking about it again next week. I'm still waiting to see what the Iranians will do. That's the big question right now. Are they going to retaliate or not?
You did get a question about the Guard deployed in California.
Yeah, that's an ongoing story too. Oh, okay, yeah, I see the questions now. Let's see. I find your opinion that a democratic Middle East means Arab countries there will be less friendly toward Israel. Israel has already been attacked many times since its creation, while these Arab nations are under dictatorship. Could this relationship really be that much worse? And on the other hand, I think democratic governments on the whole are much less likely to go to war, as most citizens don't want to risk their lives except in wars of self-defense. It can always get worse, but I don't think getting worse is really the issue here. It's whether or not it can be normalized. Keep in mind that Israeli relations with the Gulf monarchies in particular are probably better now than they've ever been. So if they were overthrown in revolution or otherwise peacefully democratized, such that a new government came to power that wanted less friendly relations with Israel, then yes, things would get worse. You know, right now, most of Israel's problems are with the Palestinians and the Iranians. But there was a time when they had, also the Syrians and the Lebanese in the form of Hezbollah. But there was a time when Jordan and Iraq and Egypt were very much in the anti-Israel camp as well. And it was only after several wars and extensive shuttle diplomacy, partly by Henry Kissinger as well as by later diplomats, that Israel was able to normalize relations with those countries. But if there were a change of power in any of those, relations could be reset and go back to what they were before the Camp David Accords. And in that case, even if those countries did not really want to go to war with Israel per se, they could engage in what you would call low-intensity conflict. I don't know if any Israelis are listening, but maybe they could back me up on this. But the 1950s saw a lot of low-intensity conflict between Israel and its neighbors. That was actually pretty much the norm from Israel's independence right through, I want to say, the 50s into the 1960s. So they weren't explicitly sending their armies to invade Israel, but they were supporting Palestinian militants, and they had some of their own agents entering Israeli territory and engaging in sabotage and acts of terrorism. I think the Israelis have a name for that period, but I don't remember what it was. Actually, that's probably a good cue for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. More painfully obvious at sometimes than others. I have more of a background in foreign policy and economics. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I always go and read it later on the VOD. And we do appreciate the feedback we get. So let's see. That said, so yes, relations can be worse. Relations can be significantly more antagonistic, especially with countries that Israel has normalized relations with under the Abraham Accords in recent years. And keep in mind that countries that have had revolutions, like Syria, can develop new governments in time that are more hostile or potentially less hostile to Israel, depending on circumstances. Iraq probably would be more hostile to Israel if they got their shit together, but right now they're still recovering from the American invasion, unfortunately. So that is a story that is still unfolding. It might be similar in other countries. It could be that if the Gulf monarchies did have revolutions, that the new governments would just be such a dumpster fire that they weren't capable of organizing significant pressure on Israel. But that would come with problems for Israel of its own, which is that if you don't have strong states in the region, then you don't have partners that can police hostile populations, which would probably generate terrorists, paramilitary groups like Hezbollah, other such groups that can commit acts of terror and sabotage Israel and its infrastructure. Maybe not in Israel itself, but they could probably hit targets elsewhere. So it's not good for Israel to just be in constant danger and have bad relations. It does need to improve them. I'm not blaming Israel entirely for its bad relations with its neighbors, obviously. There's not a whole lot they can do about that, especially at this point. But definitely resolving the Palestine issue would be among those problems. And also just being less belligerent in general. But that's a whole other conversation. We can get into what Israel can do realistically. But yeah, as far as how can relations get worse, yeah, they can definitely get worse. I don't think that's a stretch. And the idea that democracies are less likely to go to war is in academia, in international relations literature, that's called democratic peace theory. And it's pretty garbage. I mean, it sounds good in principle, but if you actually look at the data sets they've used, the data they've used has been almost entirely late 19th century on. So, most of their data set encompasses a period in the 20th century when all of the world's democracies happen to be on the same side, which is not necessarily going to be representative. Like, you had a relatively small number of democracies, most of which were wealthy countries in Europe, and to a lesser degree, poor countries in Latin America. Latin America just wasn't really involved in much of anything, starting with the late 19th century. The wars of the early mid-19th century had already been, they'd already finished with those, and relations have been relatively peaceful since. So that's not really a great example, because they'd already resolved most of the outstanding issues, or what outstanding issues had not been resolved by the early 20th century. States in the region were not powerful enough to resolve through military means, for the most part. And I would point out, too, that even in the early mid-20th century, there were wars between democratic Latin American republics, in any case. But mostly, democratic peace theory focuses on Europe. And there's just an inherently small number of democratic countries that were in Europe over the course of the 20th century. And they were all on the same side, mostly because they just had common enemies. So what happens when democracies are more ubiquitous around the world and don't have common enemies? So in that case, democratic peace theory is less robust in that case. Countries will go to war with each other regardless of what their government looks like. You could say Russia, for example, as an illiberal democracy, or even in its earlier form in the 1990s, when it was technically a democracy, disproved this theory when it went to war with various countries on its periphery. People don't really remember it well, but there actually are a number of frozen conflicts that originate with Russian interventions in the 1990s in places like South Ossetia, Abkhazia, the Transnistria Republic in Moldova, kind of sort of Crimea to a lesser degree, and of course Ukraine in 2014 and on. So, those are all examples of countries that are nominally democratic fighting each other. So it's not a robust theory. Most of its data comes from a very particular point in history that is not representative. And since democracies have become more ubiquitous, the theory has eroded in terms of its explanatory power as more democracies, whether liberal or illiberal in nature, have come into conflict with each other.
Makes sense.
Let's see. Can you please tell me what my opinion on Trump's National Guard Marine deployment should be? Sarcasm. In all seriousness, I'm very concerned about this as a California citizen. Seems like a major authoritarian breach of norms. Am I overreacting? I mean, yes and no. Like, yes, you're overreacting because technically the National Guard has not done anything explicitly illegal yet. Technically, the administration is coloring within the lines here. He says that he wants to send the National Guard in to crack down on the protests, but all they've actually done, to my knowledge, is basically guard federal buildings and possibly assist ICE with raids, although I haven't heard as much about that. But all of that is technically legal. He's not going after the protesters, as far as I know. That is being left to LAPD, which it should be. So in that sense, you're overreacting. But you could also say, no, you're not overreacting because the government keeps signaling that it wants to break the law. And so, if you come out and say, like Nomi did, that we want to liberate Los Angeles from the Democrats, like, you can't blame people for taking that seriously. Like, that would explicitly be illegal. That would explicitly play into fears that the Trump administration is authoritarian and wants to erode the rule of law. Like, if people are scared you're going to do shit like that, and then you say you're going to do it, then yeah, people are going to take you seriously. They will freak out. You can't really begrudge them that. I don't think the administration is really serious about it, but I don't think it has to be serious about that for there to be a big reaction to that. There should be a big reaction to that, because even if it's just signals, you're kind of establishing a norm there. You're kind of normalizing the idea that an administration can threaten to break the law regularly and force citizens to live in constant fear, and that's just okay. It should not be. It's a clear norm in any democratic society that just because something is legal does not mean you should do that. That does not inherently mean you should. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, basically. Forbearance is a major norm in any democracy. Trying to maintain peace and order by not trying to terrify your political opponents with displays like this. Saying that you need the National Guard when you don't obviously need to, and then having your flunkies come out and say shit that's explicitly threatening to locals, like, that's bad mojo. That is undermining the stability of the political system. And even if Trump ultimately, as I suspect he won't, actually breaks the law here, I think eventually the Guard will probably just be sent home without actually doing anything. He has kind of set the norm that this is a thing a government can do to score political points. He's kind of normalized that, and it should not be. I understand that there are politicians who will do stupid shit. That's inevitable. That's always happened. There will always be politicians that are blowhards, try to score points with their base, etc. But there really should be limits on that, and there have been limits. But Trump, in this first term and in his current term, has been trying to break them. Well, has broken them. Again, these are just norms. And that's very bad for the long-term health of democratic politics. This is not just something Trump does. This is something other governments are struggling with. This is something populists all over the world have been doing. And I think, again, it's very corrosive. And eventually the longer-term impact will become apparent. But in the short term, it just looks like more theatrics. And at this point, we're so used to partisan theatrics in American politics that people don't think anything about them. But when you start undermining your institutions, you're really setting yourself up to fail. Like, what happens when somebody else comes to power who actually is serious about deploying the National Guard in order to suppress protests by political opponents? If it's normalized, then it's going to be harder to push back on that. if it's normalized that you can kind of sort of ignore a court order, but not really, doesn't that make it easier for somebody later to just outright ignore it? You've already kind of set yourself up for people to just accept that. A lot of the breaking of norms precedes the breaking of laws. That's been a pattern in any number of democracies throughout history. And that's one of the reasons people such as myself, who are more concerned about the health of democratic institutions than about partisan politics, are particularly concerned about the Trump administration and populist politics in general. Once the norms go, then there's not much protecting you from somebody who wants to go full throttle and really just sink their teeth into an attempt to actually seize power. But it's very hard to explain that because, again, as I've talked about before on here, when you try to explain democratic norms and criticize the Trump administration for breaking them, you don't fundamentally sound any different than a partisan hack criticizing the Trump administration because they just hate them generally. Reflexive hate for the Trump administration is not really productive. Critiques should be substantive. But there's just so much noise out there that I think it crowds out the substantive critiques, and people have a hard time distinguishing between them, ever more so over time. And especially given that most of the population is not especially well versed in civics. Civics education in the United States has never been great, but it's been particularly bad, I would argue, over the past couple decades. I think people have been more and more conditioned to think of civics as watching TV. And that is especially bad mojo because partisan television, partisan news networks, etc., or whatever other kind of partisan media outlet you might consume, those are very frequently, even when people don't really know it, mouthpieces for the powerful. You need substantive journalism, not just party outlets. And people have tried to move away from establishment media because they see them as being, mouthpieces for power. And there is substantive criticism there, but the alternatives that have been embraced are just as bad, if not worse. The opacity of modern small-time vloggers, YouTubers, etc., is greater than that of establishment media. And in turn, there's actually less accountability. So we're not really getting better in that regard. I think maybe for a time the internet served that purpose, where you saw more and more voices coming out that were critical of establishment media and undermined their authority and gave voice to opinions and perspectives that needed more attention, that had traditionally been marginalized. But at this point, it's kind of mutated away from that. And now it's more just a reflexive, what's the word? Contrarianism, I guess would be the word. And contrarianism isn't useful. Just kind of being contrarian for the sake of getting views and likes is not journalism. But people are increasingly conditioned to think of it as journalism, and it's not helping. That itself is undermining the ability of the public to properly hold the government accountable. Anyway, we're getting really abstract now, so I'll just stop there.
We're getting in the weeds of clickbait content that's just made to get people riled up. Yeah, but that's near what I do, so.
Yeah, the erosion of democratic institutions is like a big conversation. That's a whole topic unto itself. But yeah, just as far as the National Guard thing, I don't like the way they're doing it, but technically it is legal. I would say that much. So I don't begrudge anybody for taking it seriously. I think people should be very critical of the way the administration is trying to politicize the National Guard here. But that said, the actual usage of the National Guard is, again, legal. And so I don't think people should overreact in that sense. Let's see, how do the Middle East countries see the weakening of Iran through all of this? Is it positive, negative, neutral? I know some countries there aren't against a weakened Iran, but would like more insight. Yeah, most Arab countries in the region, especially the Gulf monarchies, are perfectly content to see Iran get its teeth kicked in. Iran has been on bad terms with the Gulf monarchies for decades. Even before the Iranian Revolution, there was actually a lot of rivalry between the Shah's Iran and the Arab states. because the Saudis in particular kind of saw themselves as the natural regional hegemon, but the Iranians in turn believed they were. And so there was a little bit of back and forth between them as far as regional influence, backing this, that, or the other actor, what have you, fighting over islands in the Persian Gulf, things like that. The revolution just kind of accelerated that. You know, they had both been on the same team during the Cold War in the Shah's time, but after the revolution, they were not, and so the gloves came off. So the Gulf monarchies are quite pleased to see their main rival in the region sort of be cut down to size, so to speak. And even sort of other Arab countries that are kind of more aligned with Iran are not necessarily unhappy with it. You know, if you're a Hezbollah guy in Lebanon, you don't like it, but the rest of Lebanon is probably quite content with that. In Iraq, again, mixed opinions. There are a lot of militias and parties that are at least allied with Iran, if they aren't just flat out proxies of Iran. They don't like seeing Iran undermined, but in turn, Iraqi nationalists and more nationalist parties in Iraq, they're quite happy with it. They don't want Iranian influence in Iraq, and anything that kind of curbs their influence and power is going to be seen as a positive. And of course, in Syria, given that the anti-Iranian faction won, they're probably mostly pretty happy with it. But if you are one of the pro-Assad guys who are still around in Syria, you're probably not entirely pleased with it, because you may have hoped that the Iranians may have helped you out in order to give you some leverage in the new political environment that's emerging in Syria. So on the whole, yeah, most of the Arab parts of the Middle East are going to be pretty content with this. They may not like that Israel is involved, but they'll probably just tacitly ignore that. That's definitely what they've done in the past. So probably past as precedent as far as what they'll do here. And that's all the questions we had.
Nice.
We doing okay on time?
Yeah, we're hour 20 in. It's a slow week. We don't need to fill the full 3 hours. I don't know if you wanted to do more Eastern Front, or if we had any of that left.
Yeah, 44. So we could do that.
Works for me. I'm down to do some Baldur's Gate after.
I do look forward to those.
Same. Feels fresh every time, and the replayability of that game is very high. Bringing different characters and taking fights in different ways. The adjustment to it is really good. And I really like that it boosts my Dungeons and Dragons chops of just understanding the game better and learning more of the rules to the point of memorization. Because if you want to be a DM yourself, you need to know stuff like the back of your hand, so the players won't try to pull a fast one. And also just to not need to look up everything every time something happens.
Yeah, that was my problem when I tried it. I was always forgetting the rules.
Mm-hmm.
So BG3, definitely a good guide in that regard. I'm certainly much more well-versed now.
Yeah, but as a note, if anyone plays tabletop, you can't throw potions at your friends. Your DM probably won't let you do that.
More's the pity.
Yep.
I've been doing that a lot with my heal bard.
Oh,
I had a multi-class bard heal cleric.
Nice.
And there's certain equipment that you can have that'll give certain conditions to creatures that you heal.
Mm-hmm.
And technically, if you throw a potion, that counts as healing. So you can actually throw Blade Ward onto a target that way.
Wow. Whatever works.
Yeah. I think Bless is another one. So I can throw a potion and give somebody a couple points of healing, Bless, and Blade Ward.
Wow.
Pretty handy.
Yeah. It's quite the set of advantages. Cool.
Well, let's see. Well, we left off in 1943 By this point, by December 43, the Soviets have successfully pushed the Nazis across the Dnieper River in Ukraine and pushed a bit west of it. So at this juncture, there's kind of a overhang, right? The Ukrainian southern front, if you will, is further west than the center and northern parts of the front. A little bit at this point, it's about to expand. So in December, the Soviets launched what it called the three blows. So we'll get into that a little bit. These are three localized offensives, one of which is in Ukraine. The main crossing across the Dnieper had been made north of Kiev. Now they want to cross the river in the center portion and encircle some German troops at a place called Korsun, which they do. They also launched an offensive into Crimea to try to take that. They had already sort of cut Crimea off from the rest of Ukraine, so it was just a matter of pushing south into the peninsula. And then the other blow was around Leningrad. They wanted to end the siege, finally. So all three offensives happened. All three achieved their objectives over the course of the first months of 1944. So the year starts with good vibes for the Soviets. Now, over the course of the subsequent fighting, they are able to push the Germans even further west. Again, most of the fighting now is happening in Ukraine. And so they are able to, quote unquote, liberate Ukraine. Whether or not you think of it as liberation or not, I'll leave to the individual. But they do successfully retake all of Ukraine over the course of the early months of 1944, following these offensives. Now, there's actually sort of a hidden bonus offensive here that isn't well known about. This is something that an American historian named David Glantz has written about, and it's called the Jassy-Kishinev Offensive, or more specifically, the first Jassy-Kishinev Offensive. So once Soviet forces reached the border between Ukraine and Romania, apparently they launched an offensive into Romania. And again, that's the offensive I'm talking about, but it failed. And apparently it failed so catastrophically that the Soviets covered it up after the fact. And we only know about it now because there's been more access after the Cold War to World War II Soviet archives. Those archives have since been closed since the falling out between Russia and the West over the past 10, 15 years. But there was a window when the archives were relatively open, and so we've learned more about offensives like this that were more convenient for the Soviets to cover up than to be honest about. So apparently there was a failed attempt at invading Romania here in very early 1944. Interesting trivia, at least for me. So after that, there was a brief pause. Of course, there's the Rasputitsa in March, April. So that kind of shuts things down. The rainy season turns all the roads into mud, whatnot, so you can't really do much. So the Soviets start planning for a June offensive. Now, this is a big deal, because if you know World War II, you know some big things happened in June of 1944. The main one, of course, being, if you're an American anyway, D-Day, the Anglo-American / Canadian invasion of France. Now, before this point, there had already been coordination between the governments of the UK, the US, and the Soviets. And they had all talked about launching what was, in effect, a joint series of offensives. Now, we don't generally think of D-Day as being one part of a broader Allied offensive, but it actually was. So it was not just the main keystone event of June 44. It was actually just part and parcel of a broader coordinated series of offensives that happened not only in northern France, but also on the Eastern Front, in Italy, and in southern France. If you've never heard of the invasion of southern France, I'm not surprised. Everybody pays attention to D-Day. Nobody cares about Operation Dragoon. Very sad. If you've never heard of Operation Dragoon, basically, the D-Day planners wanted there to be some kind of attack on southern France at the same time as D-Day in order to draw German forces away from the D-Day landing beaches. And so they drew forces from Italy, because of course almost all of their main forces were dedicated to invading Normandy as part of the D-Day landings. So they kind of cannibalized units in Italy for this operation that was kind of a last-minute addition to the invasion plan. And so they actually did successfully land and invade southern France and push north. And that was one of the reasons that the Germans ultimately decided that it was more efficacious to evacuate France rather than just try to fight. Obviously, they fought in the initial stages after the landing, but the landings in southern France, as well as the inability to contain the British and Americans, especially the Americans, into Normandy, made holding France untenable, and so they evacuated. Anyway, Operation Dragoon trivia. You never get to talk about it, so I wanted to take the opportunity. And there was also the offensive in France that ultimately broke the German front line and successfully pushed into the what's it called? The Po Valley. There we go. The Po River is the main river in northern Italy, and there's a big open plain around it in northern Italy, where a lot of the most built-up urban areas, most economically developed urban areas are located. So pushing into that had long been an Allied objective, and they successfully did so over the course of 1944. So the Soviet portion of all of this was Operation Bagration. This was a massive offensive that the Soviets had been planning for many months that was designed to crush Army Group Center. And the Soviets had been obsessing over crushing Army Group Center for years because they saw that as the most dangerous army group that the Germans had, because that was the one that was facing Moscow. And it wasn't until 1943 that, early 43, I think, that they successfully pushed it away from Moscow. Before then, it had been dangerously close. And then over the course of the Kursk counteroffensives, they were finally able to push it out of Russia proper and into Belarus. So now Operation Bagration is going to crush it. That's the objective. And, well, basically, that's just what happens. The Germans, for their part, believed, because of Maskirovka, Soviet misdirection, which was very purposely done on this count, that the offensive was going to happen in the south. The Soviets gave them every reason to think so, via a variety of means of deception, fake tanks, troop movements that seemed to be building up the presence in the south, all this kind of thing. Also fake communications that were intercepted. Every trick the Soviets could think of, they used to try to fool the Germans into thinking the next offensive would happen in the south. And the Germans bought it, and as a result, Army Group Center was relatively weak when Operation Bagration actually began. And I actually have read a book about Operation Bagration specifically, but unfortunately we don't really have the time to just get all up into it. So the Cliff Notes version basically is that the Soviet units pushed into Belarus, but largely circumvented the major towns and cities. There were 4 specific towns that the Germans wanted to fortify and use to anchor their position in Belarus. One of them was Vityebsk, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Another one was Mogiliev, and then there were 2 others. I don't quite remember them. But what Hitler did is he turned these into hedgehogs. And hedgehogs were basically fortified positions that German troops were explicitly not allowed to retreat from. And this was very controversial with the German army, because the German army firmly believed in the wisdom of mobile defense. It's okay to lose ground, so long as you use that to allow the enemy to overextend themselves and then launch a counterattack with mobile forces of your own. The Germans had done that before many times, but Hitler now believes that his German generals just want to use that as an excuse to retreat because they don't think the war can be won. And so he has grown increasingly stubborn on this and eventually just issues an order forcing all German units to hold their ground wherever they are. And as a result, these frontline German units trying to hold these 4 towns end up getting encircled and systematically destroyed over time. And of course, this serves to weaken the rear of the German lines, which are now just in utter chaos. The Germans have been caught utterly off balance, and as a result, the Soviets are able to sweep through Belarus right up to the border with Poland. And roughly, that's where the attack on Army Group Center stops. I think the attack lasted for a couple months until August. Started in June, went until roughly August. The Soviets were not just planning to attack Belarus here, or attack the Germans in Belarus, more specifically. They also had a staggered schedule of offensives lined up. And at this point, I want to point out that after the Battle of Kursk, there was never a point again in the war when the Germans had the initiative. The Soviets would basically perpetually have the initiative going forward. And more than that, the Soviets had built up enough resources at this point to basically launch a continuous series of offensives over the course of the remainder of the war. So rather than having a big offensive and then trying to survive a counteroffensive from the enemy and then waiting a few months until both sides can reconstitute their forces, as had been the case mostly in 41, 42, and 43, now it's just going to be the Soviet army constantly attacking. They've built up their resources enough, and German resources have weakened enough that this is viable. So the onslaught on Army Group Center kind of runs out of gas around August, but roughly in that same time frame, there are two other Soviet offensives that also start. One of them is in the Baltics. It makes some ground, but the result of that is relatively minimal. I mean, the Baltics are not like a big territory to begin with, so you don't have to take a lot to kind of really harm the German position. But the result was not the complete liberation of the Baltics. The Germans retained what was called the Kurland pocket. If you look at a map of, I think it's Latvia, you can see Western Latvia has this peninsula that juts up into the Baltic Sea. And that peninsula became a heavily fortified German position that the Germans hoped to hold on to. Obviously, they evacuated some troops from it because, it wasn't entirely tenable just to have the entirety of Army Group North in that one little peninsula. But they did leave enough troops there to try to hold it. And fun trivia for you, the Germans actually held on to the Kurland pocket until the end of the war. The Soviets did not see fit to throw everything they had at it because it wasn't really that strategically valuable. They felt it more wise to throw their forces, what forces they had anyway, at Germany itself. So by and large, they just bypassed it. Let's see. Now, the other set of offensives that started up, I should say the other offensive that started up, I think in July, roughly, was an offensive into, actually, no, it would have been August. Starting in August, there was another offensive launched, this time into the Balkans. So this was the second effort at breaking into Romania, and this time it worked. Now, the fun thing here is that the Romanian government was a German ally, but when they realized the Soviets were preparing to invade, they actually offered to surrender. Specifically, they offered to declare neutrality and expel Germans from their territory. That would have been a pretty good deal, but the Soviets actually said no, because they preferred to take Romania and keep it for themselves, basically. So even though Romania actually did unilaterally follow through with a declaration of neutrality, the Soviets invaded anyway. And they were able to pretty well breeze through Romania because the German presence there was not very strong. And the Romanian units that were supposed to help them ended up just laying down arms. So that brought the Soviets to the border of Bulgaria. And the interesting thing about Bulgaria is that it was not technically a German ally. It actually had been neutral throughout the war up until this point. However, they had cooperated with the Germans economically, and they had allowed German units free movement through their territory. And so the Soviets, for their part, saw that as effectively being involved in the war and decided to invade them despite their neutrality. And as a result, they were able to breeze through Bulgaria as well. At that point, they turned northwest, and they started moving through the northeastern part of Yugoslavia, as well as into Hungary. Interestingly, they did not bother with either Greece or most of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia had actually already seen most German units evacuate. They had been struggling to hold on to the country on account of very strong partisan resistance from just fucking everybody. Everybody from nationalists to communists, everybody opposed the Nazi occupation of Yugoslavia. And so partisan resistance was visceral there. One of the strongest resistances of the whole war, in fact. And so by the time the Soviets came knocking, the German presence was already pretty minimal, and the Germans had no desire to try to fight the Soviets and the partisans. So they actually evacuated ahead of the invasion for the most part. And what that meant is that the partisans were actually able to mostly liberate Yugoslavia themselves, as a result of which there were no major Soviet troops that came into the Yugoslav territory and set up a communist government like they did in Romania, Bulgaria, and other territories they would go on to conquer later. I would point out here that it was the communist partisans, for the most part, that ended up inheriting the country. There were nationalist partisans, but ultimately they were seen as relatively ineffective, so much so that even the United States actually ended up sending most of their aid to the communist partisans. So Yugoslavia was spared Red Army occupation for the most part for that reason. Greece is actually a little different. The lack of a Red Army invasion there did not have to do with partisans. It had to do with an agreement that was made between the British and Soviet governments. Britain, well, actually everybody, had long recognized Greece as being in the British sphere of influence. Britain had played a significant role in Greece getting its independence from the Ottoman Empire in the early 19th century. And there had been a lot of British investment in Greece and a lot of diplomatic agreements tying Britain to Greece after that. So much so that Greece, again, was explicitly seen as being under British protection, even though it was not under British control. And the Soviets actually agreed to respect that, and as a result, refrained from invading Greece. Instead, as they invaded the Balkans, the Germans actually just kind of evacuated on their own because they didn't want to get cut off as a result of the Soviets and their allies seizing and liberating Yugoslavia and other Balkans territories. And at that point, a combination of Greek partisans and British commandos were able to move into Greece and restore the previous government in exile. So that's why Greece was not communist after World War II ended, unlike the rest of the Balkans, and that's why Yugoslavia had a relatively independent government during the Cold War. The Soviets did not set up their own government there. Rather, it was actually nationalist communist partisans that set up the government there. And they were sufficiently independent of the Soviet government that they were able to kind of chart their own course after the war. Let's see. Okay, so that brings us roughly, I mean, the offensive in the Balkans kind of lasted through a good chunk of the rest of the year. But in the meantime, there was also fighting west of Ukraine and in Poland. There was a big offensive starting in July, for example, as part of the corresponding offensives with Operation Bagration in western Ukraine, southeastern Poland, called the Lvov-Sandomierz offensive. And this was kind of a stretch goal. It wasn't entirely clear the Soviets had a lot of steam left after pushing all the way into western Ukraine, but a Soviet general named Konyev managed to talk Stalin into allowing him to gamble on trying to push deep behind German lines and seizing Lvov and Sandomierz. And it actually worked out. Stalin all but told him that it was a gamble that would result in his life if it failed. So Konyev had good incentive to make it work, and it's a testament to his strength as a commander as well as German weakness at the time that he was able to hedge it. So that significantly expanded the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe at a relatively early date, earlier than they were expecting. Let's see. Okay, so we already talked about the Balkans. Okay, so near the end of the year, as the Soviet, I would point out here that starting with August, I believe, the Soviet offensives in the Baltics and in the center of the front, by that point, Western Belarus and Eastern Poland had run out of steam. And they pretty much just sat there for 6 months until 1945, reconstituting their forces. In the meantime, most Soviet effort was focused in Southern Europe and the Balkans. Now, after seizing Romania, after seizing Bulgaria, and then pushing through northern Yugoslavia, they entered Hungary, and they were able to successfully take the city of Budapest. However, it took a while. The Battle of Budapest actually took on the contours of a siege. And so for a while, the capital endured significant hardship, completely surrounded by the Red Army. From what I was reading, there was significant violence within the city perpetrated on the remaining Jews in the city, as well as just political dissidents generally. I don't remember what the fascists in Hungary were called at the time. I think it was like something Iron Arrows or something to that effect. Maybe somebody in chat knows. But they kind of knew that they were on borrowed time by that point, and so they kind of just went apeshit in the city. Eventually, Hungarian forces surrendered, as well as with remaining German allies, and the Soviets were able to take the city. And that's pretty much where the year ended. which brings us roughly to 1945. Now, I wanted to mention here as a side note, just a little side note about Soviet cavalry mechanized corps. These are kind of fun. So late in the war, the Soviets knew that they were going to conduct deep penetration operations behind German lines. Basically, mobile forces penetrating the German front line and then just going as far behind their lines as possible to disrupt communications, command and control. Basically, all of the blitzkrieg stuff the Germans had done to them in 41. They had enough tanks to do it, but they wanted a complement to the tanks. They wanted something lighter. And so that came to be the cavalry mechanized corps. So as the name implies, it was mechanized, so they did have trucks and whatnot to kind of carry infantrymen forward as quickly as possible, as well as to carry supplies with them. But they also attached cavalry units with them as well, because these were also mobile and were not restricted to roads. Cavalry, unlike infantry on trucks, could go into hilly areas, even mountainous areas, and then also kind of hide in forests in order to attack the enemy rear at opportune moments. So Soviet cavalry was not actually obsolete during the war. It was not a front-line force like it had been in previous wars, but it was still useful. And the Soviets actually innovated an interesting unit here in the form of the Cavalry Mechanized Corps in order to fuck with the Germans and exploit penetrations of their front line. Yeah, one story I read of Soviet cavalry operating behind German lines in particular that I remember had to do with a troop train. This again is behind German lines. There was a train full of German infantrymen that pulled into a station. And these were basically reinforcements that were supposed to go to the front line. But as they were unloading, the train was attacked by a whole unit of Soviet cavalry, just out of nowhere, right? These guys thought they were safe. They were minding their own business in this train, just unloading. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes hundreds of Soviet cavalrymen. And because these infantry were not particularly well armed, since they weren't at the front, they didn't really have much to defend themselves with. And as a result, they ended up getting massacred. So 1 minute, you're just kind of behind the lines, chilling on a train. Next minute, you're getting killed by a Russian cavalryman.
You mean cavalry as in horse?
Yeah.
Wow.
Actual horsemen.
Horse train attack. Crazy. So, Chit-Chag, they get a little bit riled up by a few things. One of them is Djibouti. Another one is talking about attacks that deeply penetrate the rear. They just can't. They can't. And it makes me smirk as well. We're trying our best here.
Well, that's what they were called. You know, you break the front line, you have units behind the enemy's front line, and then they operate in those rear areas trying to disrupt them. So those are penetration operations, deep penetration operations, you know, whatever your terminology. Different armies have different names for them. That was the mainstay of modern warfare from pretty much the mid-20th century onwards, up until the end of the Cold War.
I wanted to give a quick shout out. You said there was an attack that distracted for D-Day. What was the name of that one?
Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France.
Yeah, so that's a type of tactic that's used in StarCraft a whole bunch, where you have two forces and you intend completely to just distract with one of them and then retreat with the force without really committing for an objective. But it makes so much noise that it occupies the enemy's attention. They're talking in their comms about, oh my gosh, they're attacking us deeply in the rear over here. We have to go defend this. And if you time the other attack to be just after it, then they're not going to be anticipating that as being the primary attack. They're going to be focused on the distraction. And the distracting attack, it doesn't really get the same glory level as the main attack, but it can be instrumental to the main attack succeeding. So let's just take a moment for all the military endeavors and StarCraft matches for the distracting team that didn't get as many kills or deal as much damage, but they allowed the main attack to succeed. Good job.
Well, that's it for 44, so we can do 45 next time, and I'll try to have some more notes as well, because there's other stuff we can cover that relates to the Soviet war effort as well. Because 45 is just going to be a couple months. The war ended on the Eastern Front in April 45. So there's not as much to get into, but we can talk about the Soviet invasion of Manchuria in 45, and we can also talk about some of the stuff that happened in Central Asia in the Soviet Union at that time during the war. And we can talk about some other trivia that maybe is lesser known.
Cool. Works for me. Thanks for taking the time and going through the eastern front of it. I don't know shit about this, and it's interesting to hear about the successes and failures of it. The less you know about something, the more it gets simplified. So one of the points that I actually told my dad about yesterday was that it was interesting to note that the Soviets didn't just completely swarm and overwhelm the Germans as much as just casual table banter would suggest. Like, they took some heavy losses as well and were struggling to keep their troops, and they actually converted a lot of troops from the countries they had, quote, liberated to fight for them. So it wasn't just as cut and dry of, oh, the Soviets won with just way more people. They kind of did, but that's oversimplifying it, and it's also kind of discounting how close it actually was.
Yeah, because a lot of records of the Eastern Front for many decades were just German and not Soviet, we kind of got more, the Western perspective of the Eastern Front was disproportionately German in nature. And the Germans talked a lot, very heavily discounted the quality of Soviet troops and kind of looked down on them. But as a result, Westerners kind of got the idea that, Soviets didn't know what they were doing and just won because of superior resources, superior manpower, like you say. They kind of undercut, that perspective very much undercuts the courage and heroism of Soviet troops, and also the degree to which the Soviet army actually did successfully learn and improve over the course of the war. They maybe still, by the end of the war, were not quite up to Western standards, but they were way, way better at the end of the war than they were at the start of it. They learned the hard way, and you have to give them credit for that.
Yep, learn by experience and through the challenges. Makes sense.
And I would point out that the liberated territories were not just like countries, they were parts of the Soviet Union itself. So like southwestern Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, if you want to count those, those were the places that they started getting reinforcements from as they liberated them. Not so much, say, like Poland, Romania, etc. Relatively few recruits from places like those. They didn't really appreciate Soviet occupation.
Yeah.
Now, there actually were some non-Soviet peoples that did fight in the Red Army. In fact, the largest Polish army in the war was actually an army of Poles that fought in the Red Army. I think it was called the Polish Home Army. It was a unit that the Soviets created in order to try to, well, for one, mobilize the Poles, but also to grant some legitimacy to their later invasion and occupation of Poland. So the Polish Home Army did represent an example of reinforcements coming from non-Soviet people. But I think that's the main example. I don't know that there's other such examples you could really point to.
Well, sweet. Thanks for going over stuff. You have a bit of a spicy chat to go over regarding Israel.
As always, as is tradition.
I don't think anyone broke TOS, but there are strong opinion havers for sure.
Well, hopefully I at least did okay in my part in trying to be partial and informative.
But the plus side is, even if you didn't, there's always corrections for the future.
Well, we do want those.
Yep. Well, thank you, Fuzzy Court, for handling questions. Thank you, Chat, for participating. And thank you, Agent Smith, for your time. We will see you on the next episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.